you very much. It's a great honour for me to be here, to be brought all this way by Rosalie and Willem Strunk, which I'm very, very grateful to, and to the people in the library for having made all sorts of wonderful arrangements for me whilst I'm here. And my only onerous task is to talk to you this afternoon. I must get on with it because I've got an awful lot of pictures, some of which I apologise, they're not absolutely brilliant because I often use them as sort of notes for myself, but I hope that they will give you an idea of the very broad areas that I'm trying to cover. My qualifications, I suppose, for talking about the Silk Road were that when I was in the British Library for 30 years, I looked after a collection of some 25,000 Chinese manuscripts dating from about 400 AD to 1000 AD, which had been found in a little cave in the great Buddhist cave temple complex at Dunhuang, which I'll point out in a sec. They were discovered having been sealed up about 1000 AD. They were found in 1900, and then Sir Aurel Stein in 1907 was the first foreigner to break into the cave, as it were, and bring back some of the treasures, which included these 25,000 manuscripts that I looked after. It was a very exciting time to start working in the library. I went in 1977. I'd been in the School of Oriental and African Studies before. But of course, 77 was a time when China was just beginning to kind of loosen up, open up a bit, and we started to get Chinese scholars to come and look at their own patrimony, which was sitting in London. And their arrival in increasing numbers prompted us to start on huge conservation projects, publication projects in connection with Chinese publishers and so on, trying generally to make the material more available to Chinese scholars, even if they weren't able to travel. So working with the Silk Road manuscripts obviously leads you into this most extraordinary story of the Silk Roads. The map here is simple. I mean, the main thing is to remember, and I'm supposed to stay near this, but I'll have to go over there and shout. So Dunhuang, where the manuscripts I looked after came from. But the main thing about the Silk Roads is that you have over here Japan, China, because many people say the Silk Road starts in Japan rather than in China, and then these main routes, north and south of the great Central Asian deserts, joining up again at Kashgar here, going down into India, going up to places like Samarkand, and then Merv, and then across to the Near East and eventually to Rome. So it's this two routes joining and then going off in all directions. So if you can bear that in mind. But it's, to call it the Silk Roads, or to call them the Silk Roads, is really a very kind of European, Eurocentric way of looking at it. And as you can see, it was a German who gave the name to these routes across Central Asia, and it's a pretty late name. But if you were Chinese, you might really think of these routes, these trade routes across the Central Asian deserts, possibly more as a jade road, because jade comes from Khotan, which is over there on the far side near Kashgar, comes into China, is worked in China, becomes a material in China which is of ritual and almost magical significance from 3000 BC, possibly earlier. So you've got the transportation of these great lumps of rock from Khotan across into China, travelling along these same routes. There's a nice, it's a Japanese illustration of a slightly mythical method of mining jade, if you like. And there was a feeling in China that jade had a special affinity with women. So you've got poor little naked ladies dipping into the freezing waters of the river at Khotan in order to pick up jade. But it's a fanciful method of mining. And one of the things that we know for certain is that silk reached ancient Rome. And it caused quite a stir. I mean, the great thing about silk and Rome, and talking about it as the Silk Roads, is that the Romans had really very little idea of where it came from. And again, I think the Silk Roads gives us again a slightly false picture of how trade was ever carried on. You didn't get one little silk merchant starting off maybe somewhere in Suzhou or Hangzhou with a bale of silk and trotting all the way across the deserts. Silk, obviously, like all the other commodities, moved from trader to trader, from oasis to oasis, changing hands endlessly as it went. So by the time it gets to Rome, its origins are completely mysterious. But it was nevertheless disapproved of. it was considered to be enormously flimsy, and, you know, yes, sending your wife out on the street in silk was as if you'd taken all her clothes off. So more references, anyway, to the existence of silk in Rome. But I won't read it aloud. I always hate people who stand there and read PowerPoints, but I'm assuming you can all read. So, and with silk, in a sense, as far as Europe is concerned, well, jade as far as China is concerned, but silk as far as Europe is concerned, the main early commodity. But you do get this extraordinary period in time from the sort of 13th century onwards, when travellers start reaching out. I mean, you have to think of Europe, it's the beginning of the great age of exploration and travel. The first travellers, mainly along the Silk Road, were in fact missionaries, but of course the best known one is Marco Polo, who everybody learns about in school, in such as the Ladybird version of Marco Polo's travels. I mean, I have my own views about Marco Polo and the text itself, which can be briefly summarised in the fact that I feel doubtful that it is a sort of autobiographical script by a single Venetian who travelled across the Silk Road. There may be some basis in a part of the beginning, but what happens with the little teeny-weeny little account, which was known as the discovery of the world, which describes travelling from the most Near Eastern parts are the most interesting, from Baghdad onwards to China and then back by sea, that what happens is that you have manuscripts which date from something like 50 or 60 years after Marco Polo's death, if we can say there was a Marco Polo, and there are about 3 people in Venice who might have been Marco Polo, but we can come back to that. If you have a Marco Polo and you decide it's this one, after his death, manuscripts start circulating, and they're very, very tiny. And what happens is that the manuscripts, as time goes on, they get bigger and bigger, because in the medieval world, if you were a scribe and your rich patron asks you to write down, copy out an account of the East by the discovery of the world, for example, if you find other interesting material, you just slam it in as well. So I see it as a kind of medieval database which grows as time goes on and new stories get added. I mean, to take one of the most famous manuscripts of the so-called Marco Polo's discovery of the world, this Bodley manuscript 264, written out in about 1300, actually consists of 3 romances, and I find it interesting that at this period it's considered a romance. It's not considered to be geography and sort of strictly useful in any way. You've got these other ones, you've got the 2 of them are about Alexander the Great, the romance of the good king Alexander, and then an extraordinary one in the West Midlands dialect, which is a sort of a conversation between Alexander and the king of the Brahmins. And then you have no mention of Marco Polo, but you have this Les Livres du Grand Khan qui parle of Armenia, Russia, and the Tartars, and of India, and the great marvels that you can find in the world. So, and it's a tiny little thing, little booklet like this, with an enormous number of illustrations. So the earliest that we have in England, at least, is a very short manuscript, but it tells of the wonders of the East, and it talks of them, as I say, in terms of romance. But later, travellers, I mean, we can't just stick to the sort of Marco Polo idea. You get the most fascinating people going in particularly Anthony Jenkinson, who was a merchant from London, who went to Bukhara in 1558. He's later followed by explorers who, like Bukhara Burns, Alexander Burns, who's very much part of the beginning of the Great Game, because the southern Silk Road in particular, and the areas going down towards India, were very much the subject of interest by the Russians coming down from the north and the British coming up from India. So travellers were exploring, spying, finding out what they could about these mysterious countries in the centre of the world. And commodities continued to travel both ways. And there are all sorts of things in China, I think, which one doesn't necessarily think of as being foreign. I suppose grapes we would accept, but grapes come into China from the west, as do cucumbers. Spinach probably came in from Persia. Peas also came in from the west. There's an enormously long list of things without which the Chinese cuisine would be much poorer, but they've all come in from the west along these routes. medicinal rhubarb from China and the Russian borders. There are very interesting things that you can say about rhubarb, but perhaps I'll miss them out for the moment. And horses, particularly. Actually, I say they're Tang to Qing, but in fact during the Han was the time when horses first began to be imported into China from places like Fergana. There are poems about these enormous, strong and powerful horses which delighted the Han emperors and delighted then the Qing emperors, the Tang emperors. Sorry, you can see Taizong's favourite horses which were carved in stone there, and then horses still being presented as tribute by the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs, bringing them to the Qianlong emperor in the Qing dynasty. And apparently it's very, very difficult to breed good horses in China, something to do with lack of calcium in the water. So horses had to be continually re-imported, and the best ones came from places like Fergana in Central Asia, so along the Silk Road. But one of the things that I was saying I was going to talk about particularly was the movement of religions along the Silk Road. And again, this is a movement in two directions. I mean, I suppose one of the most significant movements is Buddhism coming into India, from India into China from the 1st century BC, and brought by, I'm always very fond of the picture in the middle. This one is from the British Museum, but there's an almost identical one in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. This is a Dunhuang manuscript, and so it's a contemporary depiction of a travelling monk who has gone off to India to collect the sutras and bring them back on his kind of backpack, which you can see is strapped with rolled scrolls and so on. And he's obviously suffering from the journey that he has undergone. And it is also important to remember that whilst monks obviously did not carry massive great stone sculptures with them, they brought also from India into China small Buddha images from which Chinese sculptures worked. So you start with Gandhara, the great Gandharan tradition in present-day Afghanistan, and then you end with the Chinese sculptural tradition, which is based on Gandhara through the medium of little tiny Buddha images which are brought into China for duplication. And Buddhism, as I'm sure you're aware, becomes really the most significant religion in China, particularly during the Tang, so significant, so important, so economically successful. The monasteries gained vast territories, huge amounts of money, that it was suppressed by various emperors. And it struggled on. It never disappeared. It never quite reached the same heights as it had seen during the Tang dynasty in the 7th century in particular. But one of the most significant systems of thought in China from that very early period. And one of the things I found very interesting was to think, obviously I assumed that Buddhism, it's all a traffic from India into China, with the pilgrim monks who set out from China and collect sutras and come back to China and translate them. But I was idly watching television one evening. There was a program about Vikings, and they showed that in a site, a 9th century site at a place called Helgo, they found a 6th century Afghan Buddha amongst the finds. And also they found all sorts of other things. The Vikings were clearly the magpies of Europe. They'd collect almost anything that was shiny and interesting. There was a crozier from Ireland, and there was a rather elegant spoon from North Africa. So all these metal objects which had arrived. But so I don't think that the Buddha had any significance to the Vikings, but nevertheless it's an example of a Buddhist icon that has travelled in the opposite direction, again, along the Silk Roads. And one of the most interesting religions, which is obviously to us today is almost unknown, is Manichaeism, which was practiced by the Sogdians. And the Sogdians, again, if you were on the Silk Road, if you were travelling on the Silk Roads, particularly the northern route, in any time from the 3rd to the 7th, 8th century, you would meet an endless string of Sogdian merchants. They were said by the Chinese to be able to sell anybody anything. They had lips of honey. They could sweet talk you into buying anything that you didn't want. They were the dominant merchants of the Silk Road for that period. And now, of course, the Sogdians have just vanished into the dust. Their capital was near Samarkand. It was an extraordinarily important place at one point, but these are one of the sort of vanished civilizations of the Silk Road, which is one of the rather fascinating aspects of the whole community, as it were, of different cultures that have thrived on the Silk Road for a certain time and then just disappeared. Manichaeism, which I'll come to in a moment, but there's the description of the Manichaean church, if you like, consisted of two parts. You had the elect, the superior beings, and then you had those who served them. And the superior beings, as in this manuscript here, wore white, so you can see them with their tall white hats and their white robes. And so it begins in Mesopotamia with Mani, and the whiteness of the garments is very much to do with the view that Manichaeism saw a complete sort of dichotomy between light and dark. Good, light is good, and dark is evil. And they believed that all living beings have a certain amount of light in them, and even vegetables have light in them, so that the Manichaean elect were vegetarians, but they couldn't even prepare their own food, because in chopping vegetables they would be dispersing the light of the vegetables. So they would eat vegetarian food which was provided for them by their menial, the menials, and they would say, as they ate it, they would say, I have not touched anything, I have not harmed anything in this. So they stick to this kind of preservation of light in all things. And you've got all sorts of the Gnostic idea, this dichotomy between light and dark, was fairly influential in various other aspects of religion. But it's supposed to have failed because it was so antisocial, because to be an elect you couldn't marry, so therefore it can't be passed on, etc. So it couldn't hold property. So it didn't, in the end, persist. But St. Augustine is supposed to have been a Manichae before he was converted to Christianity. So it has had, and if you think of Europe, if you think of the sort of south of France and the Cathars, they were Manichaean heretics, they were dualist, they believed in equality between men and women, they also had an inner elect and they were vegetarians, so there was a crusade against them by Pope Innocent III. So Manichaeism is something which moves from Samarkand across into China. There were Manichaean temples in China in the 6th to 9th centuries, but it also has its effect in Europe through people like St. Augustine. And another, not a religion, a part of a religion, as it were, a sect of religion, is Nestorian Christianity, which is, to me, I find it a very interesting branch, if you like, of the church. It starts with this battle between, as it were, the Constantinople and Alexandria, these two patriarchs. And Nestorius believed very strongly in the humanity of Christ. He stressed the humanity of Christ rather than his sort of godlike nature. But this upset contemporary Christians because they felt particularly that this demoted Mary as the mother of God just becomes the mother of Christ, who is a human being. One of the pieces of evidence that Nestorian Christianity was active in China was the finding of this Nestorian stele, which was carved in 781, which talks of this religion of light in China. So you've got Nestorian Christianity in Chang'an, but also it moves from China to Rome. There are no pictures, sadly, of Rabban Salma, who is very interesting, who came from near Beijing, moved from near Beijing and went with a colleague called Mark on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem as a Nestorian Christian. And so, as you say, he says, I've come to pay his respects to my Lord the Pope, despite the fact that Nestorianism was regarded as a schism, a schismatic view, and was not actually approved of by the popes. The quote and so on comes from the fact that Rabban Salma wrote an account of his travels, which have survived in Syriac, but unfortunately they seem to have been kind of quite badly cut by somebody who was much more interested in the religious aspect and the actual sort of travel journal part. I mean, it would have been fascinating to know what someone from near Beijing, travelling in the 13th century to Rome and into France as well, what he would have thought, what he saw. We do know that when he arrived in Italy just as Etna was erupting, that is mentioned, but we get very little description of his, either what he saw or what happened to him, except in religious terms. But I think, in a sense, he was quite lucky that he, you know, as a stranger, as an unusual stranger, he was allowed quite a lot of leeway, as it were, in religious practice. So when Edward of England received communion from him, Edward was in France at the time, visiting his French properties. But anyway, when he went to Rome, he was allowed to celebrate Mass by the Pope. So there you've got Nestorian Christianity coming all the way from near Beijing to Rome in the 13th century. And also Zoroastrianism. This is one of the Dunhuang manuscripts in the British Library. Is a letter from a princess, probably 8th century, about lighting a fire in a Zoroastrian temple. And, sorry, I'll go back to it. Zoroastrianism, which again is a religion of light, Persian in origin, not dissimilar to Manichaeism in some ways, but which survived, and which survives still in beliefs in India and so on, but which has obviously been supplanted in Iran and Persia by Islam. But the Dunhuang manuscripts give us little insights into the practices of Chinese-speaking, well, she probably didn't write the letter herself, but it's dictated to a scribe, describing practices of lighting fires in temples. And she says she does it in order to have a safe journey, so that the lighting of the fire is a part of a ritual. And of course, then eventually Islam comes in and controls the western half of the Silk Roads by the middle of the 8th century. To come to Dunhuang, which, as I say, is a site which has given us an enormous amount of information about travellers on the Silk Road, about languages used on the Silk Road, about beliefs and practices along the Silk Road. Dunhuang is probably from about 400 or so, monks started hollowing out caves in a long cliff. I haven't actually got a very good picture of it, I'm afraid, but I'm sure many of you have been. A long cliff in the desert with sand dunes behind and sand dunes in front. In this long cliff, they carved out caves, some of which in which they lived, but in the other ones they filled with figures, with wall paintings, and so on. So, and this was from the early 5th century onwards. The whole complex was pretty much abandoned in about 1010, and nobody is altogether sure why. But Buddhism, as I said, had been in decline in China. China at the time was very much pulled in on itself. I mean, China's control of the eastern parts of the Silk Road depended very much on the strength of the central Chinese government. So during the Han, it's very strong. You have, out near Dunhuang, you have enormous encampments of soldiers guarding the Great Wall. You have people travelling further on, getting possibly as far as Rome. During the Tang, again, another period when China's central government flourishes, you have considerable control and interest in this eastern part of the Silk Road. But by the 10th, 11th century, obviously, the fall of the Tang, the Sung is very preoccupied with its own problems of threats from the north and so on. So the Silk Road areas become less and less Chinese, less and less controlled by the Chinese government, invaded by Tibetans, invaded by Tanguts and other peoples. So it shrinks in on itself. Now, the idea of the cave temple obviously comes from India, and particularly I think that Fa Xian, who was one of the earliest Chinese monks to travel to India, who left a fantastic description of what he saw. And so you have monks bringing back Buddha images, but also the whole idea of the cave temple complex comes in from India. And another reason for the decline of Dunhuang, as it were, is the rise of the maritime trade routes. To come to some of the explorers, the people who discovered, as it were, Dunhuang, and who, you know, if you think the name of the Silk Road, Seidenstrasse, being given only in the late 19th century, the Silk Road sort of impinge on our imagination after Marco Polo. They come back again in the 19th century very strongly. And you have to think about how difficult it was, that travelling was extremely arduous in those areas. If you're coming up, as Aurel Stein did, from from India. You've got to cross the Karakorums and so on. When you're in the desert areas, you've got to think about watering your camels. Nowadays, of course, most recently, we've had the massive train that went from China to Spain carrying plastic Christmas decorations. However, we'll pass over that. But means of transport, these are mostly photographs by Aurel Stein of yaks struggling through snow. You've got to climb up mountain passes. The picture at the bottom I'm very fond of. This is a picture of Sven Hedin, who I'll come to, travelling by canal along the Keria River. And that doesn't fit very well with our views of the Central Asian deserts. But whilst actually now there is an incredible problem of water in the oases along the borders of the Silk Roads, in the past, when you came to spring with the snow melt and so on, rivers actually traversed the Central Asian deserts, and you could paddle a canoe quite a long way. And Sven Hedin. Now, to me, obviously the most important explorer of the Silk Road is Aurel Stein, who brought back vast treasures from Dunhuang and other Silk Road sites. He was sent out, well, he organised himself to go out on Silk Road expeditions with financial support from the government of India and the British Museum. And since the British Library was founded out of the British Museum in 1972, and the Stein collection was divided between painting and 3D objects which stayed in the British Museum, and documents and scrolls and so on which came to the British Library. So he's a benefactor of the British Library too. He worked for the Indian government. I mean, he's an extraordinary man. He was born in Budapest to a family that was Jewish by origin, but they converted to Christianity. He went to work for the government of India, having studied Sanskrit in Germany in several universities. He also spent some time at a rather weird and short-lived institution in England, which was called the Sanskrit College, where you had to speak Sanskrit all day, including at meals. I mean, you weren't allowed to say anything else. So quite how they asked for things like marmalade is difficult to know, but it obviously was very useful in his education. He then went, which is quite important, he had to go back to Hungary to do his military service. And when he was doing his military service, he paid particular attention to map making and photography. So he was, and he became a really kind of scientific map maker, an extraordinary man. He never married. He just travelled. He never really had a proper home. He used to camp in summer on the hills above Srinagar. He just had a sort of tent there. He used to set up his table under a tree and write. Otherwise, he was almost invariably on expeditions. He had friends in Oxford. He would sometimes go to Oxford when he was writing up his expeditions. But really, he had no sort of permanent abode. And he was obviously happiest, actually, when he was out on the road, far away from any Europeans. He used to love writing to people, but it's clear that he wasn't quite as keen on sort of daily intercourse with Europeans. He liked being out in the desert, as did many of these other explorers. That you have Sven Hedin, who was one of the most peculiar, a Swede, a tremendously dangerous traveller. I'll come back to Stein and his absolutely meticulous planning. Hedin used to just sort of fling himself at the desert. He lost men, he lost animals, he used to lose his way. There's one extraordinary story of when he was completely out of water, and he and the few poor people who were travelling with him were tramping the desert, desperate in search of water, eventually on their hands and knees. And then they discovered, by looking at their footprints and their knee prints, that they'd been going round in a circle, like Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. And he used to, as I say, he lost people that way. There was a sort of death toll on Hedin expeditions, which was pretty terrifying, whereas Stein never lost anybody or anything. One horse did die, but I think that was a very old horse. He was extraordinarily meticulous in taking care of the people who travelled with him. So Hedin, a great explorer, though, he was, his explorations, he never got to Lhasa, but he did skirt the Tibetan borders. And there's an extraordinary book published in Dublin of his exchanges with Adolf Hitler, because he was very keen on Hitler. He went to see Hitler, and they had a discussion mainly about yogurt. because Hitler wanted to know if it was the secret of eternal life, being a vegetarian. And Sogdian rather hedged his bets over that. I suppose he didn't want to get into too dangerous areas. Anyway, you have the Russian explorers like Przhevalsky, who discovers the native horse, and Baron Mannerheim, who eventually became president of Finland, but was also serving in the Imperial Russian Army. He got very close to Dunhuang about 3 months before Aurel Stein got there. And he looked out across the desert. He knew that in those caves there might be paintings and so on. And he looked out across the desert, and it was sort of evening-ish. And he thought, shall I go and look at the caves, or shall I shoot something for supper? And he decided to shoot something for supper, and so he never went. He just passed on, as it were, thereby missing the coup of the century. Other later travellers who, I think one of the great things about the Silk Road is that that wonderful books continued to be produced about it from, if you like to start with Marco Polo, and then people like Baccara Burns and so on, but right up into the 19th and 20th century. That I don't know how many of you have read there's a wonderful book called The Gobi Desert by these 3 indomitable ladies who are seen setting off from Victoria Station, ready to take on the Gobi Desert. Mildred Cable and Francesca French, and Francesca and Evangeline French, but Mildred Cable and Francesca French were the ones who wrote the main books. And they were missionaries. They started out with the China Inland Mission, but they argued with everybody. The China Inland Mission was very anti-women, and they were obviously fairly fierce characters. So they just went off to the Gobi Desert on their own. They raised their own money. They did their own missioning. You can see there's Mildred Cable in a caravanserai, sitting on a bale of cotton or something, in a caravanserai, bravely tramping across the desert. Their book is absolutely fantastic, and it doesn't contain much religion, but it describes how they meet the local postman, who had cunning tricks. They learnt things like if you wanted someone to send you a pair of shoes from, say, London to the Gobi Desert somewhere, they would arrive, but the thing to do was to pack one shoe at a time, because otherwise the parcel would be stolen, but nobody stole a parcel with one shoe in it, so you would wait then for the next delivery. And one of the most important travellers, as far as people like Aurel Stein and the discovery of the manuscripts, is Paul Pelliot, who I hope you can see at the bottom there, crouched with a candle against a background of scrolls in Cave 16 at Dunhuang. The story of Stein and Pelliot's rivalry in this race is quite something. Peter Hopkirk has written a wonderful book, which I'm sure many of you know, Foreign Devils on the Silk Road, which is about the race for treasures in the very first decade of the 20th century. There were rumours about Dunhuang. People felt that there were all these lost civilizations in the desert, and who was going to get there first, and who was going to find the treasures. And the 2 main rivals, it ends up, well, the Germans actually settled on Turfan as a site to excavate, and people just left them to it. So the French and the British thought, Turfan, that's German, we won't go there. But Stein and Pelliot were both determined to get to Dunhuang. And I think it was in something like 1904, Paul Pelliot made an announcement at the International Congress of Orientalists. He said, I am going to go to Dunhuang. And he hoped and believed that by saying this, no one else would ever go there. But Aurel Stein kept quiet. He never said anything, although you can find letters from him in the Royal Geographical Society to the President of the Royal Geographical Society, where he's saying, well, I'm making my plans. Don't tell anyone. It is absolutely essential that the French don't know. And he eventually made his way to Dunhuang and got there first. Paul Pelliot, having set off on an expedition at almost the same time, gaily, slowly travelled along the northern Silk Road. Stein comes up from India to Kashgar and shoots straight to Dunhuang, getting there pretty well a year before Pelliot. And there are other travellers' tales. I write Kashgar-les-Bains because that was what Ella Mayal and Peter Fleming called it. They wrote, Peter Fleming, brother of Ian Fleming, wonderful traveller, Times correspondent, and he made all sorts of journeys within China at a time when the Japanese were invading. He also made a brave trip across the desert, on which he was compelled to be accompanied by a lady. She was very annoyed by this. She was called Ella Maillard. She was the Swiss sailing champion, and she was an intrepid traveller on her own. And she never wanted to travel particularly with a man. But the Chinese authorities forced them to travel together. And they both wrote quite amusing books in which the other figures. But one of the great things they had was that, having trekked along the southern Silk Road, getting filthier and filthier and more tired, when they arrived at Kashgar, you had the British consul, the British consulate general there, and you could at last have baths. And Ella Maillard distinguished herself by playing football with the Indian guards at the embassy there. And here you have British consul George Macartney and his wife and children. If you think back to where Kashgar was, where it's where the two routes join again, it's where the route comes up from India. And so Stein, who always travelled via India because he was an employee of the British government in India, he would come up from Kashmir to Kashgar and then set out from there, and he would have all his finds sent back to Kashgar. So George Macartney was fantastically important in Stein's travels. He was also very hospitable to all the others. If you read his letters, you can see that the Germans stayed with the Macartneys frequently. Paul Pelliot stayed there. Paul Pelliot was there for Christmas, I think, one year. And in fact, it was the year that he was sort of in pursuit of Stein, as it were, without knowing. And Macartney was very well, not exactly even-handed, but as near even-handed as he could be. He never wrote to Stein saying, by the way, I understand that Pelliot is here, he's going there, he's moving like this, and so on. But what he would do would be send on to Stein the letters that Pelliot wrote to him, sort of without a word, so that Pelliot would say, oh, moi je pars par coucher, je vais, and so on. So Stein gets it all, actually, from the horse's mouth, but silently forwarded by Macartney, who I suppose felt he had to be on the British side, as it were, but didn't like to show any too much partisanship. I mean, he himself is a very interesting character in Sino-British history. His mother was a princess, one of the Taiping princesses. The Taiping rebellion in the mid-19th century, which was put down by the Qing government with the help of foreign forces, including General Gordon. Gordon led, really, the final assault on the rebel kingdom of Taiping, and he nearly lost his reason over it, because Macartney's father, Sir Halliday Macartney, who was Gordon's ADC, found Gordon sitting in his tent, weeping copiously and holding a horrible thing in his hand, which was the severed head of one of the Taiping kings, because Gordon had promised, as a sort of good British soldier, that his captives would be taken away and tried properly. But of course the Chinese imperial government, who hated the Taipings bitterly, just took them away and cut all their heads off immediately. Halliday Macartney went on to marry one of the daughters of one of these Taiping princes, so she was a Taiping princess, and George Macartney was the result. But sadly, you know, such was prejudice in Victorian Britain that he never ever mentioned his mother or the fact that he was half Chinese. A last quite interesting expedition to Dunhuang was made in 1943 by Joseph Needham, who some of you may be familiar with, the author of the massive, I don't know how many volumes it is now, but sort of 20-plus volumes of the history of science and civilization in China. A scientist who, bizarrely, and this is something that nobody can quite get to the bottom of, in 1943, Joseph Needham, who very much wanted to go to China, was appointed the British Council representative in Chongqing. This is in wartime China. You know, China is at war, the Japanese are approaching, Britain is at war, and you would think the last thing they wanted was to bother with the British Council in Chongqing. But nevertheless, they sent Joseph and another. Joseph was the scientific representative, and his brief was to get in touch with Chinese scientists and see what they needed. And the result was lots and lots of test tubes being sent over the hump, and books about science and other bits of rubber piping and things. I mean, he was very assiduous in his work, but people always assume he must have been a spy. What else was he doing? He did, in his letters that you can see in the National Archives, he did say things like, well, they'd really like radar, or they're quite interested in electronic this and that, and so on. So he was trying to help the Chinese to get slightly more advanced things. I don't know how easy those things were to take over the hump. But in a sort of slack period, he led an expedition to Dunhuang, which is quite out of character, all the way up from Chongqing. It was a very significant expedition in many ways, one of which was that we took, amongst those with him was the painter Wu Zuoren, who had never seen a camel before in his life. But any of you who know Wu Zuoren's paintings now, camels figure amongst the pandas very hugely. And so this was the first time that Wu Zuoren ever saw a camel. Anyway, to come back to Stein, which I should, sorry. So Stein, I mentioned his surveying and his map making. There he is at his map table. And the white blob behind him is one of his dogs. He always took a dog with him on expeditions, usually a smallish terrier. And this is, I'm very fond of this photograph. I'm sorry it's a bit dim, but in a way it helps. This is one of the Dunhuang beacon towers, out near Dunhuang. During the Han Dynasty, they built beacon towers which soldiers used to signal, so that any trouble anywhere, you would light a fire on top and send your smoke signals out across the desert. And I always liked this picture very much because it shows Stein at his most meticulous. You've got a measuring rod there laid so that the photograph shows exactly, well, you can take from it the height of the thing. And he's also got a person there. The person, I think, is rather wonderful. I mean, I think it's one of Stein's local assistants, well wrapped up. But it always looks to me like a kind of a little-known trip that Queen Victoria made to the Gobi Desert in shortly after her death, actually. But anyway, this is, and the things that Stein brought back, again, all sorts of objects that he found in the desert. But again, it's this meticulous map reading and measurement thing that he does. These, again, the measuring stick laid out here, these figures that he'd found in Astana, measuring stick here with these Buddha figures. And one of the most interesting things about Stein's work is that although the Chinese hate him passionately for taking things away from China, they still have a grudging admiration for the fact that you can go to the same places he visited, use his maps, use his photographs, and recreate exactly what was there. Sometimes the sands have swept in, things have changed, but you know exactly what it was like when he was there. So anyway, I must gallop on, actually. One of the things, I mentioned his meticulous preparations. These are one of his shopping lists. And you can see, I mean, the detail is absolutely fantastic. And you've also got all these sort of things like, fur-lined this, fur-lined that, pair of... These are all not just for Stein, but they're also for the people travelling with him. Lots of, 4 pairs puttees and things like this. All of these purchased in India and taken with him all the way. He had sleeping bags, special sleeping bags made and so on. And you see dog's coat without something or other, dog's coat lined with namda and fur. So the dog, here he's moved his head a bit, but there's the dog, and there's a dog up there on the camel. He always had a dog with him, and he looked after them with the greatest of care. But he did look after those who travelled with him as well. He also was the first person to take Marmite into the Gobi Desert, apparently. It had only just been discovered, and he could see the benefits. I just wanted briefly to say his first expedition was to look for mysterious manuscripts that had been appearing in the bazaars in Kashgar, and he finally found that they'd all been made by this gentleman called Islam Akun, and Stein's photograph is labelled Islam Akun the Forger. And once again, you can see just behind Islam Akun there is a small white dog, which is holding him at bay. I won't go into the forgeries, but you can read about them, and they're great fun. On his second expedition, you can see the typical team that Stein has, dog in front, wearing coat, Stein in the centre, he has his Chinese secretary, he has Indians with him. He took Indians from the Survey of India in Dehradun who helped him with the map making. They were vitally important to his recording of the whole area. Anyway, comes to the cave of the 1,000 Buddhas on his second expedition and meets the little Taoist who has appointed himself guardian of the caves, who first discovered this cache of manuscripts in Cave 17, a tiny little niche off a major cave, which was simply piled from floor to ceiling with paper scrolls. There's Pelliot, who, as I say, was dallying in places like Tumshuk, while Stein was collecting all this kind of material for the British Museum. And the 7,000 fairly complete scrolls, which are now in London, almost entirely Buddhist, but not completely, and including the world's earliest dated printed book, the Diamond Sutra of 868, which has recently been preserved and is in the most stunning condition. And it's interesting that Stein himself didn't realize. He actually recorded, when he left Dunhuang, he went to Annecy and he started looking through the material that he'd got from the cave, purchased from little Wang, the Taoist there. And he lists, in his first preliminary listing, he says, printed roll, dated. He gets the date wrong by about 2 years, but he doesn't say to himself, my goodness, that's an awful long time before Gutenberg. He just leaves it like that. And in fact, it was his great rival, Paul Pelliot, who came to see it in London and really realized the significance. There are all sorts of other wonderful things amongst the finds in the cave. I mean, you've got a calendar dated 877, which includes here the pictures of the animals of the 12-year cycle, which are very charming. Woodblock, again, very early. So printing, sort of much of the evidence for printing being invented in China is that what we found in the cave, moving from rubbings to printed sheets and then to the Diamond Sutra, which we can go into. There was paper recycling, was clear in China. This is a piece of paper which has been written on but has been used as a paper bag. You can see the seam sewn down the side. It's a very thick, sort of clothy paper, so it's quite practical. And that paste brush, which has just been made of a twist of paper, used perhaps to repair manuscripts and so on. The condition, if you think back, if I go back to the Diamond Sutra, how it is now, if you look at the Diamond Sutra now, this is how it is at the moment, and then this is how it was first found. It had this massive stain across the front and all these tears and so on. And one of the things that's interesting is it was patched. So it was patched probably in the 10th century before it was put into the cave, and it was really wearing out. That's the sort of thing the paste brush would have been used for, to patch up manuscripts. And in a sense, the condition of the Diamond Sutra gives us a clue as to probably why all these scrolls were put into the cave. Some people say they were put in there to sort of save them from invasion, but there were no invasions for about 25 to 50 years after the cave was apparently sealed up. But what I think is clear now is that it's a depository of items that are past their best. The Diamond Sutra, as you can see, was even in, over 1,000 years ago, was well past its best. It was stained, it was patched, it was falling to bits. But you couldn't just throw away a Buddhist sutra. You had to sort of preserve it. So it's a kind of burial place. Because even the quite good manuscripts, like the one that you can see at the top, those often form parts of collections. If the sutra is in 12 rolls and you've only got 11, then perhaps you put it in the cave with the other things. And to end, perhaps, with... I'm sorry, I've realised I've gone all over the place and probably confused you completely, but staying with Dunhuang and the cave, one of the sad things, I think, is that if I end with the great question of restitution, which I won't go into, but if the question of restitution obviously arises with massively important material like, say, the Diamond Sutra, but also this massive archive of paper rolls going back to the 5th century, is that at the time that Stein was there, if you look at the dates, there was this, Ye Changshi was actually the education commissioner of Gansu. So he was there when Stein arrived, because Stein actually arrived, in 1906. And he knew of the existence of the cave because the little Taoist had sent him rolls and had sent him little Buddhist figures that had come out of the caves. And he is on record as writing in his diary, it just seems too far to go. So he never went and visited, and he could have closed the cave and kept all the foreigners out, but it didn't happen. And so Stein was the first to get into the cave, collect massively. He was followed the next year by Paul Pelliot, who collected for the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And it was only about a decade later that the Chinese authorities finally sent carts to collect the rest and bring it to Peking. and sort of relative safety, if you like. So I'll end with Ye Chang Chi, having conscious that I've gone on quite a long time, and that I've also probably covered a confusing variety of aspects of this rather complex sort of area of roots. So if you've got questions or comments, then you're very welcome to raise them.
We do have time for 10 or 15 minutes of questions, so after which we can repair to the lobby and some refreshment. So who would like to ask the first question? Please.
How does one remove the stains from the old diamonds?
This is a very, very interesting question. How do you remove the stains from the Diamond Sutra? Well, we know a lot about the Diamond Sutra now because our greatest conservator worked on it for about 7 years. And the question of the stain was an interesting one. By the time I knew it and Mark knew it, which is, say, in the 70s, the stain was not there. But, and it's one of the problems with the Dunhuang collection, and this is that with the best will in the world, it arrives in London in 1910, and it's in the British Museum, and people start going through it. There's Lionel Giles in the British Museum, and there's also Paul Pelliot, who keeps coming over from Paris, because he's absolutely fascinated to see what Stein got and compare it with what he's got, and so on. So he starts picking out the best things, and particularly for an exhibition that was held in the British Museum in, I think, 1913. And as soon as things were identified as being good, unfortunately, the attention of the British Museum's then conservators was turned upon them. And of course, in those days, they knew absolutely nothing about Chinese scrolls, Chinese paper, Chinese anything. They did have some experience. They had some Japanese scroll mounters. And this, again, the things that came from the caves are not scrolls, they're books and documents. So they should never be mounted. That was never the practice. But unfortunately, just because they're long rolls, the Japanese thought, well, we'll mount them. So they tended to scroll mount far too many pieces. And most of the work of our conservation section over the last, well, I left 2 years ago, but sort of say over about the last 15 years has been removing backings put on in the British Museum in the first, well, I suppose between about 1910 and 1920, with the best will in the world, but not necessarily the best execution. Now, the Diamond Sutra stain, there was a sort of, I'm sure it's apocryphal, it's a bit like the story in the British Museum about, Karl Marx in the reading room, that he always used to go every day, and someone talking to an ancient, one of the doorkeepers, and saying, who do you remember from the reading room? He said, oh, Mr. Marx, the man with the beard. I wonder if he ever finished his book. And it's along the same lines that in the conservation studio they used to say they washed it. So they put it in water and they washed it and they said, my goodness, it's filthy. Look at all this that's coming out. Well, the stain did disappear, but unfortunately it is certain that the whole of the scroll had originally been dyed with a yellow dye made from berberine. The yellow colour, which people will know from Korea, Japan, and so on, is associated with Buddhism and often used on paper scrolls. Berberine is very strong. It's a good insecticide, but also it's the Buddha colour. So it would have been a wonderful yellow. But one of the awful things about the berberine dye is it's completely water-soluble. It only has to look at water, it's gone. So the Diamond Sutra is now a lot greyer than it would have been when first seen. One thing that we did discover when it was being conserved, there was a certain amount of testing done. We know that no chlorine was used. I think it was purely water. So if there had been chlorine, that could have damaged the paper. But no, it was just water. But unfortunately, it took the yellow dye away. And I suppose I could say as a rider to that, I mean, before Mark Barnard looked at the Diamond Sutra about 26 years ago, well, we all looked at it. We had a great sort of conclave, and we said something must be done about it. It had terrible backings on it. It was cracking, it was horrible. We knew we had to take the backings off. But of course, touching something like that, it's a world treasure. The Chinese are watching carefully. very worrying. So we did lots of experiments, got lots of scientists in to see if there were ways of fixing such yellow as remains. And they did discover wonderful ways of doing it in a test tube by altering one ion from negative to positive. But we didn't dare do anything, actually. But so Mark just had to work using the minimum of water and incredible care, and he managed to remove 7 layers of backing without damaging and, in fact, greatly improving the thing, but without losing any more yellow. So towards the end, it is a bit yellow, but it's very sad that it was lost from the frontispiece.
Yes, please.
Sure.
How appropriate is the name Silk Road nowadays?
Plastic road, or whatever, yes. I don't think they... Well, yes, I'm not sure quite. I should think more silk now goes out of Shanghai by boat than it does across the Silk Roads. But, you know, that Xi Jinping has recently made a great sort of speech about the new Silk Roads, and by which he means the train. He also means the road, because if you go... I mean, I was going along the Gansu corridor just over a year ago, and where it used to be a potty little road, very rough and so on, it's now a massive superhighway with enormous lorries thundering along it. So there is a huge amount of transport by road. Then you've got these massive trains, which now cross all the way across the desert. But how much silk they take, I don't know. Yeah, you can tell me, perhaps.
My intention was slightly different. According to later research, is the name Silk Road still justified? Was silk the primary commodity that was transmitted?
So silk was...
Was silk the primary commodity? Can we be sure that silk was the most important commodity that was transmitted?
I think for quite a long time it was one of the most significant, because it was in great demand throughout the Near East. I mean, if you think, and the whole of Europe as well, eventually. I mean, eventually Europeans learned the secret of silk production themselves. And also, I mean, when you get to the sort of 12th, 13th century, they tend to prefer heavier, locally made silk to the much more flimsy Chinese silk. So it goes down quite considerably. And you've got so many other things. I mean, you've got huge numbers of things like precious woods, precious stones being moved along, animals, and so on. So it was very much a mixed trade. But silk, I think, was very, very important, say, from sort of, you know, the 1st century to probably about the 7th, 8th.
Dr. Wood, the Silk Road, obviously the silk was from China to Italy and Rome. What was on the way back? It was the other materials. So it might have another name when you go that way.
Well, I mean, you get the introduction of cotton from India is one thing that comes that way up. But in terms of what goes the other way, not so much of coming in terms of material like that, but as I said, foodstuffs, all sorts of foodstuffs. The horses were very important, and jade continues. I mean, right until the discovery of the Burmese jade sources in the 17th, 18th century, jade from Khotan is still massively important. Well, it remains massively important. So that would be a huge part of the transport. And you've got things like lapis coming up from Afghanistan, travelling on the Southern Silk Road. You've got coral. You've got all sorts of things.
Can you enlarge upon your doubts about Marco Polo? Can you do that briefly?
Yeah, well, where to start? I think, well, if I start in a sense from now and then go backwards a bit, now I feel, as I say, that there is a text. We start with a text. We don't know which. We don't have a sort of base text. We don't have Marco Polo's manuscript of the discovery of the world. We have manuscripts circulating, sometime after he died. And as you see, the one in the Bodleian doesn't actually even have his name on it. So nobody in the Bodleian, well, nobody in Oxford in 1300 would have known that this was anything to do with anyone called Marco Polo. So you've got texts circulating which are just called the discovery of the world. And as I say, they get bigger and bigger as time goes on. I mean, there's a very good one in Toledo, which is probably 15th century, mid-15th century, people say, which it contains 200 passages not known in other discovery of the world texts. So, and you've got versions, this obviously is a very popular text because there are something like 50 different languages. You've got Irish, you've got Bohemian, you've got every Italian dialect, you've got various French dialects, etc. You've got Latin. So you've got a plethora of manuscripts called the Discovery of the World, which get bigger and bigger as time goes on. So, and as we don't have kind of an original, my feeling is that you start with something, but scribes just keep adding to it. I mean, we know about copyists' mistakes. There are lots of very funny mistakes that copyists made, which one can go into. But so in the medieval period, there's no sort of sense of copyright. A text is not sort of sacred in any way, so you would add into it. There are no mentions of Marco Polo and his family in any Chinese records or any Mongol records. Even in Venice, the legend is that they come back all ragged, but with jewels sewn into their garments, and then tell this wonderful tale. But even in Venice, there's very little, there's nothing really that says there was this amazing traveller. Well, I suppose you could say everyone in Venice was an amazing traveller, but nobody seems to have taken any great notice. There are records in the Venetian archives of 3 Polo families, and one of them people sort of settle on, and there is a house you can visit in Venice that they call the Polo House. Well, that wasn't acquired by a Polo family until something like 25 years after the supposed return. There's another thing that he's supposed to have returned and written the text in prison after being captured in battle, be held in prison in Genoa. Nobody can find out which battle. None of the dates kind of tally. How do I go on? And, I mean, I think that the absence... You can always... He's got these tremendous partisans... because you can always argue both sides. I mean, I say there's nothing... people always say, oh, well, he was serving, the Khan. He was an important person at court. And the fact that there's absolutely no record, whereas we have record of Persian siege engineers, we've got records of doctors from Turkey, all sorts of people at the Mongol court who we know. So the Mongols were not averse to using foreigners in all sorts of ways, but why don't they mention these guys? And then people say, well, he wasn't perhaps quite as important as that, he was rather low down and so on. Other ways that you can look at it, which I don't think actually are so fruitful, are the things that are missed out. That there's no mention of the Great Wall, there's no mention of foot binding, and there's no mention of chopsticks, and there's no mention of tea drinking. Though I think these things, people have criticised that as an approach because, everybody's view of everything is different. My feeling is that it's a sort of, it's something that's been cobbled together. I mean, people have done all sorts of work on it. One man did a very early sort of computer analysis and worked out that he thought it was written by 13 different people. Well, I mean, that would fit with my theory that things are added in, and so on. And there are things like the language of the text, what foreign words are used. There are no Chinese I think there's something like 2 Chinese names, no Mongol words. All the kind of foreign type vocabulary is Persian or Turkish. But then people say, oh, well, he would have known Persian and Turkish, so you kind of can't win. I just think that it's there's a medieval something there, and that it's possible that, he's supposed to have ghostwritten it with a man called Ramusio, who was quite an important... No, Rustichello, sorry, Ramusio was later. Rustichello, who was quite an important romance writer. Edward I of England was very keen on his Arthurian romances, which he used to write for him. And it begins just like a romance. It says, ladies, gentlemen, knights and servants and so on, come and listen. And if you look again through, and you should always look through the earliest possible text, the mention of the name Marco Polo practically never occurs. It sort of suddenly... you've been trailing across the desert, very boring. And then all of a sudden it says, and I, Marco Polo, saw this with my own eyes. So there is a very nice lady in Germany, much greater specialist in Romance languages than I am, because I'm not at all, and she reckons that actually Marco Polo is a sort of literary device to make what is a very dull account of different places into something faintly more interesting.
Maybe one more question, then I would like to turn the podium over to Hannah Kim for the closing remarks. Yes, please.
Thank you for that lovely talk. I'm wondering what are your views on repatriation, and do you think there's any chance that text will return to China?
I can now speak about these things because I don't work for the British Library anymore. Not that I would say anything I think that they would particularly worry about. I mean, I do think it's a very, very difficult area, and that I think you could make an argument for the Diamond Sutra as being, an absolutely sort of world one and only thing. Because, as I say, world's earliest securely dated printed book, because it's so long. There are earlier bits of printing, but this is just fantastic. It's absolutely wonderful. You could make an argument for that, because, I mean, it seems to me that it's on, it's on the sort of same lines as almost as a sort of imperial regalia or something like that. Obviously, with the great mass of the rest of the documents, I think that, as the British Library is doing, rather slower than many of its colleagues, actually, the answer is to make stuff available digitally. And so the International Dunhuang project is putting everything up on the web, which has advantages. It's not just to escape the restitution question. The huge problem with, say, a country like China, where there are thousands of people who now travel, if they all wanted to kind of handle and see Dunhuang materials, they wouldn't last very long. I mean, there really has to be a kind of restriction on the actual use of the actual objects. We have to kind of keep them for future generations. But the easiest way, I mean, actually microfilm is a very good way of looking at the Dunhuang manuscripts, but people now prefer everything. I mean, for things to be on the web, it's great. So if you go to the IDP website, you can now see manuscripts from the cave at Dunhuang from Paris, London, St. Petersburg, Peking, and lots of little collections as well, all up there. So, and although it's still fairly sort of primitive, eventually you'll be able to do amazing things, like joining up places. We know that there are manuscripts where the front half is in London and the back half is in Paris, and you'll be able to fit them together and so on. And mostly Chinese scholars are very happy with this, with the use of a digital image on the web, and it does preserve the original.
Thank you very much. I think I know a lot of us have more questions, but we can perhaps ask them privately during the reception. At this point, I would like to ask you to just sit down for one moment and ask Hannah Kim to come and make a closing remark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Francis Wood. So lastly, I'd like to thank again Dr. Francis Wood. And on behalf of UBC and UBC Library, I'd like to present a small gift of our appreciation. Only if I can find the gift.